The Victorian era is considered to be the golden age of the English novel. It was a time of contrast, of prosperity and poverty, of morality and depravity, of peace and protest.
Good day, ma'am, and to my fellow future educators. I am Neldib A. Bonco, one of the assigned reporters for this group. For today's video, I'm gonna tackle you about the Victorians, or also known as the Golden Age. But before we will go to the topic, let us get to know who is Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, or also known as Alexandrina Victoria, was born on May 24, 1819 in London. She is the only child of Edward Augustus and his wife Victoria. At the age of 18, she became the Queen of England and ruled for 63 years. The Victorian era is considered to be the Golden Age. It was a time of contrast of prosperity, poverty of morality, and depravity of peace and protest. Before children's literature could fully mature, it had abandoned the shackles of moral didacticism. They were more interested in the message rather than in literary quality. These books tend to offer up what adults believe was good for children, not necessarily what children themselves enjoyed. It was not until the late 19th century that talented writers who were committed in writing entertaining stories for children as opposed to morality tales began to emerge. This phenomenon has been attributed to several developments as follows. First, we have the strengthening of family unit. Second, rapidly developing technology that made possibly still cheaper books along with high quality, full color printing. Third, the slow but inexorable rise of status of women. Fourth, the growth of widespread educational opportunities, including mandatory education legislation in both US and Great Britain, creating more readers. And lastly, the continued growth of middle class, which further broadened the reading audience. The confluence of these forces made possible the first golden age of children's book during the reign of Britain's Queen Victoria, hence the Victorian period.
These are the authors and their works for the adventure or boys' stories genre. Captain Marryat with his works Mr. Shipman Essay and Children of the New Forest. Robert Michael Ballantyne, The Coral Island. George Alfred Henty with Cleve in India. And Robert Louis Stevenson with his works Treasure Island and A Child Garden of Verses.
For the fantasy stories, we have Lewis Carroll and its work Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and its sequel Through the Looking Glass. George MacDonald, The Princess and the Goblin and its sequel The Princess and the Curly. Juliana Horatia Ewing, The Brownies and the Other Tales. Charles Kingsley, Water Babies. Beatrix Potter, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. James Matthew Barrie with its famous story Peter Pan. And Kenneth Graham with his work The Wind in the Willows. For the realistic stories, we have Edith Nesbit with its famous works The Children and It, The Phoenix and the Carpet, and The Story of the Treasure Seekers. Next, we have Rudyard Kipling with its famous works The Jungle Book, Stocky and Co., and Kim. Thomas Hoggs and its famous work Tom Brown's School Days. And lastly, Francis Hodgson Burnett with its famous works Little Lord Fauntleroy, A Little Princess, and The Secret Garden. Thank you.
So good day everyone, I am Joyce Cabusao and I am one of the reporters of this group. So let's start. The United States. The first one is the adventure or boys stories. Like British boys, American boys of the 19th century enjoyed adventure stories. But the Americans preferred stories set in their own country. Perhaps it was the isolationist tendencies that have never been far from the American consciousness. Perhaps it was the fact that the American frontier was still a reality, but until the late 19th century, most Americans felt no need to go looking for adventure abroad. So the first author is Oliver Optic. Oliver Optic is the pseudonym of William Taylor Adams. So pseudonym means pen name. So Oliver Optic is the pen name of William Taylor Adams. So he is very popular among 19th century boys. He wrote The Outward Bound or Young America Afloat in 1867. The next one is Horatio Alger Jr., whose works include Rag Dick and Street Life in New York in 1867. Alger's name became almost a household word, and his heroes become beacons of the poor. So if we say that beacons of the poor, it means it became the inspiration for the poor. Why? Because these heroes were always downtrodden boys. Boys means di pang daog-daog sila. Who struggled for financial security and respectability, both of which they ultimately gained through a combination of moral uprightness and hard work. However, clearly the best writers of boy stories in America was Samuel L. Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. He wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in 1876. This story is about Twain's own boyhood experiences in Hannibal, Missouri, and seems very clearly suited to children because of its mystery, adventure, and comedy. He also wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in 1884. This is one of the greatest American novels ever written because it is a more sophisticated book filled with biting satire, and underlying the sometimes rollicking humor, a serious tone. Twain never really saw himself as a writer of children's literature, and would probably be surprised to find his name mentioned so prominently in a text on the subject. So, the second one is the domestic or girls' stories. Although the British writer Charlotte Yonge wrote one of the early domestic stories, or also called the girls or family stories, which is the Daisy Chain in 1856, it was in the United States that domestic novels were mostly favorably received. In these stories, virtuous heroines, often coming from dire circumstances, achieved good fortune and ultimate happiness, typically in the arms of a handsome young man. So, notice na to na naadjay similarity ang stories ni Alger og ni Charlotte Yonge. So, if the themes of both the Alger stories and the domestic stories sound very familiar, they should or they are essentially updated versions of old folk tales, in which persons of humble origins rise to wealth, fame, and happiness primarily because they are good individuals. So the next writer is Susan Warner, writing under the name of Elizabeth Witherell. She wrote one of the earliest American domestic novels, which is The Wide Wide World in 1850. This is about the enormously popular work, which was both highly sentimental and religious. So the next one is Louisa May Alcott. She is the most famous of the domestic novelists, and her masterpiece is The Little Woman in 1868, and it is still popular today. It is about a thinly disguised history of Alcott's own family, and the work rose above most domestic stories of its day through its strong characters and lack of didactism or sentimentality. And the next writer is Susan Coolidge, pseudonym for Sarah Chauncey Woolsey. So again, pseudonym means pen name. So Susan Coolidge is the pen name for Sarah Chauncey Woolsey, and she is best known for What Cathy Did in 1872. This is a sentimental story of unruly Cathy who experienced a spinal injury that impairs her walking, learns kindness and responsibility. This book remains in print today, which some skeptics attribute to its catchy title. Other popular writers of these girls' stories include Margaret Sidney, pseudonym for Harriet Lothrop. She wrote The Five Little Peppers and How They Grew in 1880, and this is all about the adventures of a fatherless, poor but happy family. And it's very sad. So the next one is Kate Douglas Wiggins, and she wrote The Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm in 1903. This was given a new lease on life in the 1930s by a Shirley Temple film. So naa siya film na in the 1930s. Also, kang Eleanor Porter's Pollyanna in 1913 is about the irrepressibly cheerful Pollyanna waiter who brings sweetness and light to a dark New England town, and this book has been kept alive by the media, and it was first filmed in 1920 and starred Mary Pickford. But the most famous version was the Walt Disney's 1960s film or production starring Hayley Mills. And in 1989, there is a musical remake featuring an African-American cast in a made-for-television film, and it was named after Pollyanna, and the name of the musical is Polly. These works are all sentimental in tone, contain their share of moralizing. So let's proceed. Fantasy stories. Fantasy has never been as appealing to Americans as to the British. Perhaps it has something to do with the Puritan. So Puritan were a member of a group of Protestants that arose in the 16th century within the Church of England, demanding the simplification of doctrine and worship and greater strictness in religious discipline. So kaning mga Puritan are paano sila strict when it comes to religion. So no nonsense work ethic that has imbued the American culture and made fantasy suspect. However, one American fantasy from this early period bears notice, and that is Frank Baum's, or ang iyahang complete name gyud kay Lyman Frank Baum. He wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900. Now much better known in its film version than in its book form. So naana da siya film version ang kaning The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Baum blatantly attempted to give the fairy tale a distinctly American dress in these stories. and famously succeeded. Its powerful visual imagery and strong characters lent themselves well to the widescreen, and many believed the film to be superior to the book's rumbling structure and stilted style. So bali, mas masabtan kunuhay sa film ang kaning The Wonderful Wizard of Oz kaysa sa magbasa ka sa book kay kuan man siya. It has a rambling structure and stilted style. The story is nevertheless an American institution. Baum wrote numerous, largely mediocre sequels on the demand of his youthful readers. So, the children's book illustration in the Golden Age. So, in this age, na sila mga book illustrations. Children's book of 18th century and earlier either lacked illustration altogether or contained crude woodblock illustrations such as those in Orbis Pictus. Kaning Orbis Pictus is a children textbook na siya. Serious artists could not be enticed to draw for children's books. But because of the growth of children's book publishing and the development of printing technology, it allows the full-color printing attracted many talented artists to the field by the end of the 19th century. So, dako kaig natabang printing technology towards the children's literature because it attracted a lot of talented artists to create more stories to children. So, the earliest great illustrator of English children's book was George Cruikshank. He illustrated the first English translation of Grimm's fairy tales in 1823, and he was also the first illustrator for the Charles Dickens work, The Oliver Twist, in 1838. The second illustrator is Walter Crane. He produced lavish illustration for many children's books. This includes The Baby's Opera in 1877. This is a collection of nursery rhymes complete with music. So, kanino ang si Walter Crane kay nag-illustrate niya nag-produce siya of lavish illustration for children's books which gibot niya og music. So the next illustrator is Randolph Caldecott. He illustrated John Gilpin's Ride in 1878 and numerous other poems and nursery rhymes in stunning series for children. So kung gusto mo og example na sa kadtong PDF nga gihatag ni ma'am, so just look at figure 1.4. Caldecott, for whom the American Library Association's Caldecott Medal is named, is credited with bringing liveliness and humor to children's book illustration. So, naaday medal that was named after Caldecott, and this is the American Library Association's Caldecott Medal. This is credited with bringing liveliness and humor to children's book illustration. So the next illustrator is Kate Greenaway. She illustrated Browning's The Pied Piper of Hamelin in 1888, and she also illustrated other works including some of her own poetry. So kung gusto gapon mo kita og example ani, so just look at the PDF and see figure 6.5. So there is also a medal named after Greenaway, and this is British Library Association's Greenaway Medal. It was named after her because she had her own delicate and distinctive style which became so popular that it actually influenced children's clothing styles at the end of the 19th century. So, grabe di kayo ang na-contribute ni Greenway, no? Kay she influenced man good the clothing of children's at the end of 19th century. So, the next illustrator is Leslie Brooke. So, she illustrated the Johnny Krause Garden in 1903, and it is notable for the wry humor of its illustrations and its delightful characters. So, lahi po ang style ni Brooke. Naapod siya yung mga humor of its illustration and delightful of characters. And the next is Arthur Rackham. So, tanawan niyo sa figure 6.6 na dito iyang illustration. He was an artist of great originality and versatility, particularly good with line. So he is good with line. And he was one of the few early illustrators who dared to experiment with a new impressionistic style of children's illustration. So, isa siya sa mga early illustrators that dared to experiment the new impressionistic style of children's illustration. So, Rackham also illustrated a vast number of children's books. This includes the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, 1900, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is very familiar to us, in 1907, The Aesop in 1912, Mother Goose in 1913, and Graham's The Wind in the Willows, published in 1940.
Good morning, everyone. This is the continuation of our discussion, which is popular literature, Great Britain and America. So most of the child readers of this time spent much of their reading, not the celebrated classics, but the popular press. Like for example, the comic strips, in which this is the first crop in Victorian era and so-called penny dreadfuls with no pretensions into literary quality. The dime novels hit the market about 1860. This book is paperback wrapped in yellow and also known as yellowbacks or yellowback literature that can be sold into 10 cents and consisted largely imitations of Gothic novel. The detective fiction was the most popular stories of Deadwood Dick, Babysitter's Club, and R.L. Stein's Goosebumps. This is the books wherein examples of continuing tradition in popular literature. So we move now into 19th century. So the 19th century, the children also saw a magazine. One of the popular magazine is Aunt Judy's magazine. So Aunt Judy's magazine appealed largely to girls in Britain. The second one is Union Jack. Union Jack and Luck were quite clearly for boys. The third one is Youth Companions. Youth Companion, one of the first longest-lived of the American periodicals, which published from 1927 to 1929. The fourth one is St. Nicholas. It was published in the United States from 1873 until 1940. and had its first and famous editor who named Mary Mappis. Mary Mappis Dodge. She is the author of beloved children's novel Hans Brinker or Silver Skates in 1965. Both of those magazines could boast a high quality of writing. Win the War from 1920 to 1994. The period between the two wars saw the emergence of some of the most notable fantasy figures in children's literature, which may reflect the need for escape felt by adult writers and the work of the devastation of the First World War. Most of the great fantasies of this period were British. So there are many popular British authors. The first one is Hugh Lofting. The second one is Alan Alexander Milne, followed by Pamela London Towers, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, Arthur Ransom, Enid Blyton, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Carol Ryrie Brinks, Eleanor Estes, Wanda Gag, Marjorie Flack, Ludwig Bellmans, Dr. Seuss, and Dr. Seuss. So let's back on Hugh Lofting. So Hugh Lofting is one of the British author. So Hugh Lofting, his books entitled The Story of Dr. Dolittle. It's all about physician who talks animals in the first era. These stories are highly imaginative. Lofting's works generally promote admirable ideals, pacifism, love for animals. Works generally promote and animals rather, and general tolerance rather. Alan Alexander Milne, his books entitled Winnie the Pooh, a cultural phenomenon with its appealing cast of anthropomorphic toy animals engaging in adventure that watchful eye of young Christopher Robin. So, young Christopher Robin, he is the son of Alan Alexander. These books has much of humor, and its sequel, The House of the Pooh Corner, in 1928, speaks as adult as to children, which may account for its lasting appeal and for the keen interest shown by literacy critics. Pamela Towers. So, Pamela London Towers, she work is some of controversy, which is Mary Poppins in 1934. Mary Poppins is a collection of wildly fanciful stories about an eccentric nanny. So eccentric nanny, which means an acerbic character of the outrageous nursemaid, has raised many an adult eyebrow, and indeed in her nature was dramatically altered in 1964. The other one is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. The Hobbit, or his book is The Hobbit or There and Back Again in 1934. is the prequel to his great trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, a fantasy for adults. The Hobbit story is quite suitable for children. With its lovable context, self-appreciating hero, Bilbo Baggins. The story is high fantasy featuring dramatic battles, fanciful creatures, very real dangers, and just a touch of humor. Tolkien's work achieved gold status in 1970 and certainly accounted one of the great fantasy works. Arthur Ransom, he is the most notable figure between the wars, Swallows and Amazon in 1930. 11 sequels through 1947 recount the adventure of the Walker children and their friends on their summer holidays engage in a variety of outdoor activities. His books are quite escapist and temperament. So let's move on to Enid Blyton. Enid Blyton, one of the most British writers who must be mentioned, if only because of her phenomenal output and enormous popularity. She wrote over 600 worldwide books, 37 in the year of 1951. One of her best-known works was The Magic Faraway Tree in 1943, were translated into several languages. It's been criticized by adults for their far-fetched plots, their simplistic and stereotype vocabulary, and their traditional attitudes. And Laura Ingalls Wilder. Laura Ingalls Wilder is best known as American writer between the wars. Her books entitled Little House in the Big Woods in 1932 began a series of 9 books based on her childhood and young adult experiences on the American frontier in the later years of the 19th century. This combination of domestic story with a frontier adventure proved the perfect formula for one of the most successful publishing ventures of the era. Carol Ryrie Briggs, also a frontier or family story. Her books entitled Caddy Woodlawn in 1935 is in the Wilder vein. So the next one is Eleanor Estes. His book entitled The Muffets in 1941. The first of the series was a family tale set at the time of the First World War. In all cases, the family viewed as an anchor and source of strength, a perspective that would change by the end of the century. Next is Wanda Gag. So Wanda Gag, her books entitled Millions of Cats in 1928, a charming yet earthy work with folktale qualities that is still in print. Next is Marjorie Flack. So Marjorie Flack, her book entitled The Story About Pink in 1933. So also Monroe Leaf, illustrating Richard Lawson's The Story of Ferdinand in 1936. Among others, Ludwig Bellman's Madeline in 1399 and Dr. Seuss' And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street in 1937 and a host of rollicking books spanning 5 decades. That's all for our report. Thank you, and I hope you will understand, and God bless.